بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم اللهم افتح علينا فتوح العارفين ووفقنا توفيق الصالحين وانفعنا بالقرآن والذكر الحكيم اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا بما ينفعنا وزدنا علما يقربنا منك برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت يا حي يا قيوم تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا سهلا اللهم أعذنا من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا واصلح لنا شأننا كله لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم وبعد فقال الإمام شيخ الإسلام حجة الإسلام الغزالي رحمه الله ونفعنا به وبكم فأنت إذا عاتيت العبادة حقها وجدت حلاوة المناجاة فاعلم أن الذي يهون عليك ذلك ثلاثة أمور. So remember last time talking about just finishing off on the obstacle of society or obstacle of people, the obstacle of socializing with people, and how that may hinder us on our path of spiritual purification and the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So discussed at length about the different aspects of trying to remove oneself from situations where you're excessively wasting time mingling and mixing with people when you could be using that time more constructively. So he says, towards the end of this chapter now, he says, there are three things, if you keep in mind, that will help you to tread this path of isolating yourself more and keeping away from company that is not going to be conducive to your spiritual progress. أحدها استغراق أوقاتك في العبادة. The first thing is to try to occupy your time in ibadah. Try to occupy your time in worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فإن في العبادة شغلا وإن الاستئناس بالناس من علامات الإفلاس. But if you're occupying yourself in worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're not going to have time to socialize very excessively or mix with people very much or waste time mixing with people. And obviously this doesn't include those situations where it's actually wajib or recommended to mix with certain people for certain benefits. This is talking about those times which are just of no benefit to you and coming close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if you're someone who's got certain ibadat that they do every day, they have certain awrad, certain portion of Quran they have to read, certain portion of wird they have to read, certain portion of dhikr, certain portion of nafal they have to pray, and so on. You're occupying yourself in those things, then you don't even have the time to go and then spend with people. So he says, spending a lot of time with people in their company is a sign of bankruptcy, meaning iflas, bankruptcy, spiritual bankruptcy. So if you see yourself or you see someone all the time they're just with other people socializing, hanging around, not occupying themselves in their own by themselves, then this is a sign of spiritual bankruptcy. فإذا رأيت نفسك تتلع إلى ملاقاة الناس وكلامهم من غير حاجة ولا ضرورة فاعلم أن ذلك فضول ساقه الفراغ والبطر ولقد أحسن من قال في هذا المعنى. So he says, look at yourself, because the whole idea of tasawwuf and purification is to always examine ourselves. That's the whole idea of why we're studying all of this, because until we start examining ourselves, in a sincere way, we'll never be able to improve ourselves. And this is why, there's a saying called Al-Mu'min Mir'atul Mu'min, from the Prophet ﷺ, which means the Mu'min, the believer, is a mirror of a believer. So having good company also helps us to examine ourselves. If we're in good company, we can often examine ourselves as well. So that's what it means, Al-Mu'min Mir'atul Mu'min. It may be just by being in that good company, you realize things about yourself. When you see that person, how their state, their behavior, etc., you realize some of your own faults. Or it may be that you may give nasiha to each other as well, more overtly. So that's how we can learn more about ourselves. And then obviously reading these type of books, we should be internalizing, reflecting into ourselves what we're reading to see where we are, what our state is, and how we can improve ourselves. So, Imam al-Ghazali says, look at yourself. If you find that you want to always meet people, speaking to people, socializing, without any reason or darura, any necessity or good haja, like a good reason. If, for example, a Muslim brother who's sick in hospital, and you go to visit them, and you spend time talking to them, that is not, obviously, wasting time. That is actually a very beneficial thing. That's something that will bring you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, that's what it means. There is a haja, there is actually a need there, for the visiting of the Muslim brothers in hospital, etc. So this is just talking about just generally, socializing excessively for no particular reason, or no particular spiritual benefit. So he says, if you find this inclination in yourself and you feel that this desire to do this, but if you sincerely look, you can't see any real justification for doing that, apart from you're really just doing something that you find pleasurable, so it becomes under one of the pleasures of the dunya, really. فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّ ذَلِكَ فَضُولٌ سَاقَهُ الْفَرَاغُ وَالْبَتَرُ. So he says, then know that this is simply a waste of time. It's fadul, it's just a waste. And it's just come through boredom and, having nothing to do and just feeling that, so you're not occupying yourself in ibadah or dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The one who occupies himself in dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he comes to love that dhikr. He tastes the halawatul iman, he tastes the sweetness of the dhikr and the sweetness of iman. Then he no longer has desires to go and mix with people and spend time socializing, because he's getting more pleasure being with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But that does take some effort, that takes some mujahada. So initially you do dhikr, you'll find it difficult, you find it hard to do the dhikr and to get away from people. But afterwards, once someone is established on that, then they will find it hard to leave it and go back to people. Once I had a dream of Shaykh Jalaluddin al-Rumi, rahimahullah. It's quite a long time ago, when I was at that time reading a lot of the Mathnawi. The main book of Jalaluddin al-Rumi, rahimahullah, is a book called the Mathnawi, which is quite a 3-volume or more book, originally in Persian, but I was reading that in English. And I was reading it quite a lot in those days. And I had a dream of Jalaluddin al-Rumi, rahimahullah. And in the dream, there was lots of people trying to come to him. They wanted to be with him and kiss his hand and say salam and talk to him and have his company. So these people were rushing after him, and he was sort of rushing away from them and going into salah, Allahu Akbar, being with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So all the people, they want to be with him, but he just wanted to be with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was a nice dream, mashallah. So he says, in the meaning of this poem, إن الفراغ إلى سلامك قادني ولربما عمل الفضول الفارغ أو ولربما عمل الفضول الفارغ. So he said it is just faragh, it's just sort of boredom that has led me to come to greet you. And perhaps the one who is bored or has nothing to do, he will do a lot of wasteful actions. So boredom is not something that you find in the people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because boredom comes to the person who doesn't have that strong connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if they had that strong connection and that love of dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would have no boredom. Because whenever they're alone, they have nothing to do. Actually, that's where they want to be. Because then they're with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're doing dhikr, they're doing dua, they're reciting Quran. And they're finding pleasure in that. So there's no boredom for them. So boredom is something that afflicts those who don't have that iman, that connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So then they become afflicted with boredom. Yeah, they become afflicted with boredom. What is boredom? Let's think about that. Because it afflicts a lot of people. Muslims, non-Muslims, a lot of people, they become afflicted with boredom. So what is boredom? Boredom is a feeling of emptiness. It's a feeling of what we call qalaq. It's an uneasy feeling. It's a restless feeling. It's a feeling that something's not right. It's a feeling something needs to be done, something needs to happen. So why is that there? Because this afflicts all human beings except for those, like I mentioned, who have that strong connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So why is that feeling there in every human being? When they become empty from all things that are occupying them, they start feeling this thing called boredom, this uneasiness, this restlessness. And that's actually why if you see a lot of non-Muslims and even Muslims, they try to occupy their time so much so they don't feel this feeling. So there's people nowadays who actually get into this work mode. So they work excessively. You find it especially amongst English people. So they will say to you, my life is my work, I work to live, I live to work, whatever. So why? Because then that time is occupied. They're busied up, then they haven't got that time to feel that. They haven't got that time to come back to themselves. They just want to occupy the time. All the time. Why? Because when they're back to themselves, that boredom comes in, and that's what we call qalaq. It's a feeling of uneasiness, and why we have that feeling is because we're missing something. The human being in his deep core is missing something, and that is his creator. That thing is missing is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because all of us have come from that source. We've come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's our creator. He's more closer to us than our own parents. Can you imagine why we're so close to our parents, but can you imagine someone who actually created you? He actually made you. He's so intimate with you, he's in your mind, he knows everything you think. He's so close to you, yet we're so far away from him. And that is that feeling qalaq that the human being has. And that can never be satisfied unless they have that connection back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is why that feeling will never go. Ala bi dhikrillahi tatma'innul qulub. It is only by the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the hearts then find rest, tatma'in. So the tu'manina is the opposite of qalaq. Qalaq is like a restlessness, and tu'manina is like a stillness. And that stillness will only come when a person connects back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that's like the most important relationship for the human being. Is the most important relationship for the human being, is a relationship with his creator. وَأَكْثَرُ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. But most human beings don't know. It says in the Quran, Most human beings are unaware of that fact. Yeah? But just because most human beings are unaware doesn't mean it's not true. Yeah? So that's boredom, qalaq. Yeah, that's the cure for boredom as well. Dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. At first it's difficult, but persist. Do the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You'll get through that and you'll get the halawatul iman, halawatul dhikr. You'll feel the sweetness of the dhikr, the sweetness of iman, the sweetness of that connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's the cure for that qalaq, that restlessness that the heart feels. That's why our scholars said, theologians said, this, the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the belief in the Creator, the knowledge, the certainty that you have a Creator is so inbuilt into the human being. It's part of our fitrah. This is how the human being is built. The natural way we are built is to recognize that there is a Creator. And that's that restlessness and uneasiness that we have. She goes back to when Adam alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, ihbitu minha jami'an. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, when it says, He said to Adam alayhi salam and Hawa, go down, go away from Jannah now, because you've disobeyed me. Ihbitu means to go down. Because they were in a high place, close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They were in a place where they were in connection to their Creator. They were sent far down. But interestingly, the Quran says, ihbitu minha jami'an. Not just you two, but jami'an, all of you go down. All of you. Jami'an. Meaning it was all human beings. Because what happened to Adam and Hawa represents what happens to all of us. Because we were at one time with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all human beings. It says in the Quran, when that there was a gathering, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought out all the souls of Bani Adam and He said, Alastu bi rabbikum, am I not your Lord? Qalu bala, they all said yes. So all human beings were there with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So ihbitu minha jami'an, you all of you go down. Now you go. So we're now far away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're far away from the one who created us. We're far away from our source. And so the way to connect back to Him is through dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because whenever we remember Him, fadhkuruni adhkurkum. Remember me, I'll remember you. So whenever we remember Him, He remembers us, and so we connect back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah give us tawfiq. So as this poet said, so many people who are farig, like they feel bored, they feel empty with their time, and it ends up doing actions which are wasteful. They end up doing actions which are wasteful. So then Imam al-Ghazali says, once you start doing ibadah in the proper way, in the sincere way, in the way that it must be done, وَجَدْتَ حَلَاوَةَ الْمُنَاجَةِ, you will start feeling the sweetness of the connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you make dua, you are dialoguing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَاسْتَأْنَسْتَ بِكِتَابِ اللَّهِ, you start feeling the pleasure and the intimacy with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran. Like they said Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anhu, he used to have two lines on his eyes, in his cheeks, from excessively weeping whenever he would recite Quran. That closeness, that sweetness that he's feeling from reading the Quran. And we have in our time, people like Shaykh Sayyid Ramadan al-Bhuti. Shaykh Sayyid Ramadan al-Bhuti, the Shaykh in Damascus, he's considered the leading Shaykh in Damascus. You go to his gatherings, darses, whenever he recites Quran, he will start weeping. Whenever he recites Quran, he will start weeping. There was one dars he started a dars in his local masjid. Because normally the Darsi is in a very big masjid called Jamiatul Iman, which is one of the really big sort of university mosques in Damascus, where they have like thousands of people can fit there. So he has two classes there in the week for public, and you have thousands of people coming to the Dars. It's an amazing, sight to go there if you go to Damascus. You go to these public lessons of some of these great ulama. It's thousands of people come. It's amazing. Just for normal darses. And not just Sheikh Booty, but you find this in many masjids around Damascus, And the sheikhs are just teaching things like inheritance law or fiqh or aqidah, not like giving lectures or those type of inspirational khutbahs or things, but just teaching books. And you literally get hundreds or even thousands, like Sheikh Booty, you get thousands of people coming every week to study with the sheikhs. And these are normal people who are like accountants, or they do other jobs during the day and they come in the evenings to study with the sheikhs. That's really one of the really nice, beautiful things that you find in Damascus. Whereas in other places, people in the evenings after work, they're like watching the television or doing other things to entertain themselves. Mashallah, these people are coming out to the masjids and sitting in the darses with the sheikhs. So Sheikh al-Booty, his main darses in Jamiatul Iman are huge, but then he started one small dars in his local masjid, where his father used to be the imam, and now he's the imam. Is in the local area where he lives, in Ruknuddin. And he still does khutbah, Friday khutbah there till today, but he started a dars after the Friday Jum'ah Salah, and not many people knew about it to begin with, So we used to attend that. There was only like about 200 people or something, which is small for his standard, And he was teaching Risalatu al-Qushayriya. Risala al-Qushayriya, one of the Tasawwuf texts of Imam al-Qushayri rahimahullah, one of the very early books on the Tazkiyatun Nafs, about 4th century Hijri. And he would, whenever during the dars, the whole dars, he would always be just crying. You felt like saying to him, stop the dars, because he would just become so overwhelmed all the time, the whole thing. The whole dars reading about the stories of the awliya and all of these things, just continuous. So those tears are a sign of wajd. Those type of tears. People cry for different reasons, but those tears at that time are wajd. It's called wajd, ecstasy. It's a feeling of extreme ecstasy that causes those tears to flow when you see that person, having those tears at that time. There are some people who cry, at the beginning of the path for different reasons, because they just done tawbah, and they'd cry for their past sins because of their feeling of overwhelming remorse for what they've done. But those people like Sheikh Booty at that point is wajd. It's a different cause of he's feeling that sweetness of the Quran when the tears are coming out. So that's what he's talking about, the halawatul munajat. If someone has got this sweetness of intimacy, of discourse with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's got no need for mixing with people at that time. واشتغلت عن الخلق, so he will be preoccupied away from people. واستوحشت من صحبتهم وكلامهم. وفي الخبر أن موسى عليه السلام كان إذا رجع عن المناجات يستوحش من الناس. It's narrated in certain narration that Musa alayhi salam, when after he had been to speaking with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Musa alayhi salam from all of the prophets is given this special title Kalimullah, the one that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has spoken to directly, without the mediation of an angel or anything, of Jibreel alayhi salam. And this also, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had this as well, obviously, even on a higher level, because he not only spoke to him, but also he had a direct vision of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But this was one of the things that Musa was giving, a direct speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So can you imagine that, after he's spent, remember those 40 days, 40 nights, it says in the Quran. وَإِذْ وَعَدْنَا مُوسَى 40 لَيْلَةً. Yeah? We promised Musa 40 nights. For 40 nights he was with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the direct company of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but without the vision of him. Can you imagine from that coming back to people? From that coming back to normal people. Yeah, so it says in the narration, it says he was يستوحش من الناس. He felt very difficult to come back into the company of people. Because it's just from coming from the extreme height to the extreme low of company. And we were sitting with Shaykh Akram recently. Shaykh Akram Nadwi was also mentioning this about the Prophet ﷺ. He said, imagine the Prophet ﷺ on the Mi'raj when he was actually in the company of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The direct vision and direct presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. From there he has to come back down to the people. And he says this is a big jihad, a big mujahada for the Prophets. This is a really big mujahada for them. A really big struggle to then come back amongst normal people. And giving da'wah and people just insulting you. People throwing stones, children throwing stones at you. Where you've been and where you've come down. It's a huge mujahada, huge jihad and struggle for them. But that's what the Prophets have to do. And that's a higher level than the one who goes and hides himself away. There are some people who will just go and hide themselves away and they'll be between themselves and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they can spend their time in ibadat. And that's a great thing. But an actual higher struggle is to actually come back to people and be amongst normal people with all the difficulties that brings. And that's what Imam al-Ghazali, we were talking about last time. When he mentioned about those people who lived in the mountains of Lebanon. And one of the scholars said to them, come, why have you left the people? Why have you left the ummah of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And they said, we're not strong enough to do what you're doing. To do da'wah and to teach people and to give people. We're not strong enough. We need to hide by ourselves and protect our own iman. But this is the state of the Prophets. The job of the Prophets is to come down. They're with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but then they have to go amongst the people and be, they have to have friends, they have to have relatives, they have to have wives, they have to have all of these things, relationships with amongst the people. So it says, Musa wa kana yaj'al isba'ayhi fi udhunayhi. It's narrated in one narration that Musa, when he came back amongst the people from being with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, at first he used to have to put fingers in his ears to block out their speech. Because he couldn't, imagine the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and then he's hearing speech of people. لئلا يسمع كلامه وكان كلامه عنده في النفور والوحشة في ذلك الوقت. So at that time the speech of the people was just too low for him. The type of things they talk about and these sort of things. كأصوات الحمير, like the voice of the donkey is for us. Compared to the speech he had heard from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فعليك بما قاله شيخنا رحمه الله. So he says, I exhort upon you what my Shaykh has given us. My Shaykh. Probably referring to Imam al-Haramain once again. So he mentions these 3 lines of poetry from his Shaykh. ارضى بالله صاحبا وذر الناس جانبا. Be pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as your companion. Or it could be, and leave people, leave the side of people. صادق الود شاهدا كنت فيهم وغائبا. Yeah? So be pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the one who is able to give you sincere love. Yeah? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-wadud. He's the loving. But His love is the pure love, unlike the love of people. Yeah? So be amongst them, but be absent from them. Be amongst them, but be absent from them. And we talked about that before as well. قلب الناس كيف شئت تجدهم أقاربا. No matter which way you look at people, you will find them to be scorpions. No matter which way you look at them, literally turn them this way or that, you'll find them to be scorpions. In other words, they'll harm you. You'll find harm from them, you know. But you won't find harm from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if you spend your time with Him. وَثَانِي قَتْ وَالْتَمَعْ عَنْهُمْ بِمَرَّةٍ. So that was the first thing that will help you to avoid excessive mixing with people. So that's the first thing, to preoccupy yourself in the presence, being in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second thing is to cut off all desires for that which is with people. Cut off all your hopes and desires for that what people have. So part of the reason why we spend time with people that is not beneficial to us spiritually is because we have hopes or desires for things that people have. You know? فيهون عليك أمرهم فيهون عليك أمرهم لأن من لا ترجو نفعه ولا تخاف ضره فوجوده وعدمه سواء. So, you know, if you see a person, you don't have any hopes that he can benefit you in any way, and you don't fear harm from him in any way, you're indifferent to that person. Huh? Whether he's with you or not with you is irrelevant to you. Talking about a general person, any general person. But if we feel we're going to get some benefit from that person, then we may want to get close to them or talk to them or so on. Getting something from them. This could be someone, it could be a material gain, you know, at work, or different types of gains that people can get, you know. So then we'll spend time in their company. Or if we fear their harm. You know, just a crude example, like school kids. You know, often school kids, they're scared of a bully or something, but then they try to sort of get in with them. You know, that type of idea as well. So sometimes you may want to, you know, be just scared of them, so you have to give them excessive adab, or you might feel that you have to give them time, or things like that. But if you had a strong iman, and you had that certainty that nothing can benefit you except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and nothing can harm you except for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that wouldn't be relevant to you. Yeah? That would not be relevant, because we would see with certainty that there is no harm and benefit except from through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and these people are just asbab. These people are just means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put there. Yeah? The actual one who is benefiting you is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The actual one that is harming you is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In reality, they're nothing other than means. They're nothing other than just appearances, you know, forms that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created, and He is the one who's the actual actor. And that's our aqidah. That's our aqidah. Yeah, very good question. Yeah, so would you still take the means or not? So the short answer is you take the means, but you don't rely on them. You take the means, but you don't rely on them. You take the means, but you rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's the key difference. So yes, our sunnah, the sunnah is of the Prophet ﷺ is to take the means. So that's why we take the means, because that's the sunnah. but there's no reliance upon it. So okay, there's a guy bullying someone. If you take certain means, you may be able to get out of that situation. Take those means, but don't rely upon that. Rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So make dua. Oh Allah, I rely upon you. You're the only one that can get rid of this problem for me. And then you take the means. But if you believe the means will actually get rid of that problem, it might get worse. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might want to teach you a lesson here. You're relying on yourself. You're relying on the means. He may want to teach you a lesson and make the thing worse for you. So that's the key thing. Where's your reliance? And once again, it's something that comes through increasing ourselves in iman and coming closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The stronger our iman becomes, the closer we become to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more certainty, the more awareness we are of the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and how He's acting in everything. So there are some people, if that bully was bullying them, they wouldn't even take the means. They would just make dua and they would leave it in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that can happen, and that's not wrong for that person at that time, because at that time he's in a certain stage, and he's in a certain state of intimacy and certainty with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he doesn't take the means, and the thing, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sorts it out. But the normative way, which is a sunnah, is to take the means, but rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the norms that we are told to act and behave by. We only take the other way is if we are in that state at that time, and no one will tell you or need to tell you when you're in that state. You will know you're in that state because you will do that at that time. So that's a subtle thing that it's just need to understand. A beautiful example of this is where the Prophet ﷺ did the hijrah. When the Prophet ﷺ did the hijrah, is the ultimate lesson for us in this matter of taking the means but not relying upon them. So when the Prophet ﷺ did the hijrah to Medina, he was in danger of his life from the Quraysh, who actually had put money on his head now, put a large ransom on his head. So when he left Mecca, he took various means to avoid being caught. He didn't just say Tawakkaltu ala Allah and just walk out, although he could easily have done that. Being the Prophet ﷺ, he could easily have done that. He was protected in a way that no one else is protected. But why? He's setting a sunnah for us. He's setting a sunnah. He's an example for people. Inna lakum fi rasulillah uswatun hasana. We have to have an example as people. So setting the example, he leaves Mecca the opposite direction from Medina. So instead of going in the normal way to Medina, because all of the Quraysh, they knew the Muslims are going to Yathrib, he left in the opposite direction. So he's trying to avoid being caught. And every day when they were, when they were going, the son of Abu Bakr would come with a flock of sheep and would take the sheep over the tracks, so the tracks would become covered. The tracks of the two camels that they had, he and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhuma. So you can see all the precautions they were taking, so they couldn't even be tracked in the desert. But what happened? The Quraysh, some of the Quraysh, they hired the best Bedouin tracker. He was the best one in the whole of Arabia. I forget his name. You've heard of these trackers, haven't you? They have them even now, like Aborigines have them, and they are able to track people's traces even in the desert from very, very small, minute signs. It's like an amazing, almost miraculous the way they do it. They have them still in some like Aboriginal communities and things. So they got this Bedouin who's the best tracker in the whole of Arabia, and despite all of the precautions that the Prophet ﷺ had taken, he led the Quraysh to the Prophet ﷺ next to in that cave. When the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr were in the cave, he led them right next to the cave. So you see, the skill he had as well. But what they here, there's lessons once again from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, you took the asbab, but the Prophet ﷺ was not relying upon that. He was relying upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved him from the Quraysh by a miraculous way of having the spider there, and the pigeons with the nest, and the spider with the web. So when they got to that cave, they saw those animals, the web and the pigeons, and they said they can't be here because there's a spider's web here, there's a pigeon with a nest. These animals wouldn't be here. And that is in the Quran, that incident, إِذْ هُمَا فِي الْغَارِ, when the two of them were in the cave. And he said to his companion, do not be afraid. Yeah, the Prophet ﷺ said to his companion, do not be afraid. Abu Bakr at that time was only afraid for the Prophet ﷺ. Abu Bakr was feeling afraid, not for himself, but for the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ said to him, do not be afraid, Allah is with us. Yeah? Allah is with us. So you see that tawakkul, that was the reliance upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not a reliance upon all of those means that they had taken. So this is what the Sunnah is teaching us. Yes, take the means, but if we rely upon the means, maybe they would have been caught. Yeah. But of course, the Prophet ﷺ is relying upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saves them. So that's the sign for us, Take the means for what you have to do, but do not rely upon the means. If you rely upon the means, maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He wants to guide you further, He may teach you a lesson. So sometimes you will see that in our own lives, You'll find that in your own lives. Just examine your own lives and see what happens. Sometimes when you say, I trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this matter, and you put your full faith in Him, He will always He will always help you in that matter. But when you start doing something, you start thinking of your own skills. You start relying upon your own skills, your own knowledge, your own expertise. You think, you know how to do this thing. And you might fail in that thing. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just giving you a lesson. He's giving us a lesson that you should not be relying upon yourself. Rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is the thing about taking precautions, but then, making dua. Because when we rely upon Allah, we make dua. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us. والثالث تبصر آفاتهم وتذكر ذلك وتكرره على قلبك. So the third thing that will help us in keeping away from wasteful company is to just keep and reflect upon and keep in mind always the dangers of being amongst people and socializing with people. The dangers of it, and remember it, and always keep it in your mind, always think about it, reflect upon it. So this is why coming to these type of durus, reading these type of books will help us, because you're always thinking, reflecting, reminding ourselves. لأن هذه الأذكار الثلاثة إذا لزمتها ترحت بك عن صحبة الخلق إلى باب الله تعالى والتفرد لعبادته وحببته إليك وألزمتك بابه وبالله التوفيق والعصمة. So these are the three things. The last one was what's often called a knowledge cure, or the knowledge aspect. So just to have the knowledge and to think about and reflect about it. So it says if you keep to these three things, so occupying yourself in the dhikr and the ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Secondly, not having any hopes or desires with what people have or what people can benefit you with. Recognizing that they can't benefit or harm you. And thirdly, keeping in mind and always remembering and reminding oneself of the harms that come with the company of people. These three things, he says, will lead you to staying away from these of the people and staying with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And will make that thing beloved to you as well, of being in the company of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one who gives tawfiq and protection. May Allah give us tawfiq and protect us, and give us understanding of the words of Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah. Al-a'iq al-thalith al-shaytan. The third obstacle at this stage of purification is the obstacle of the shaitan, alayhi al-la'na. ثم عليك يا أخي بمحاربة الشيطان وقهره وذلك لخصلتين. So Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah says, the next thing upon you, O my brother, is to fight the shaitan, is to battle against shaitan and to defeat him. So he specifically uses the word to fight and battle against, because the Quran tells us he's aduwwun lakum, the shaitan is your enemy. فَاتَّخِذُوهُ عَدُوًّا. So take him as an enemy. Take him as an enemy. How do you take an enemy? What do you do? How do you deal with an enemy? You're not kind and loving to them. He's your enemy, so you fight them. He's your enemy, the one that you cannot ever make up with. He's not an enemy that you can make peace with, because he never will make peace with you. He may trick you to think that he wants to make peace with you, but he will never make peace with you. He's your avowed enemy. He's your enemy till the bitter end. And he's trying to get you in the worst possible way, because he's trying to get you into the eternal hellfire. He's trying to get you in the worst possible way you can imagine. So you have to fight him. It's narrated once that Shaitan came to Musa alayhi salam. Shaitan said to Musa alayhi salam, he said, I'm sorry for what I've done, and I don't want to be in the hellfire, and I don't want to I don't want to be in the hellfire. Ask Allah to forgive me. So Musa alayhi salam, having mercy on him, said, well, he made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Oh Allah, he's sorry for what he's done, etc. I'm just paraphrasing my own words. I can't remember the exact words of the narration. Said, please forgive him. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, was it Musa or was it Ibrahim? Am I getting mixed up with this? Anyone know? It was Musa or Ibrahim. I think it was Musa alayhi salam. I read the story a long time ago now. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to Musa alayhi salam, he said, okay, fine, I will forgive him. Tell him I will forgive him, but on one condition, that he goes to the grave of Adam alayhi salam and he bows to the grave. Because he refused to prostrate, to bow to Adam alayhi salam. So this was the condition. So Musa alayhi salam said to him, I've got good news. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to forgive you. You don't have to be in hellfire and all of this stuff. All you have to do is go to the grave of Adam and bow to him. So it says, Shaitan, he turned away arrogantly and said, I didn't bow to him when he was alive. Why would I bow now when he's in his grave? So this is Iblis, alayhi la'na, he just wants to get human beings into the hellfire. Because of his arrogance, because of his envy. So hasad is a destructive, very destructive disease. That's a very destructive disease. There's debate amongst the ulama, which is the root, the hasad or the takabbur? The envy or the arrogance? Because it also mentioned in the Quran, Aba wastakbara wa kana min al-kafirin. He refused to bow through arrogance. So most agreed that its arrogance is the root, because if you had no arrogance, you had no feeling that you're something big. Because arrogant literally means to think that you're big, to think that you're something. Yeah. If you had no arrogance, then you wouldn't have hasad. If you thought you were nothing, if you didn't think you were something, you wouldn't really have that hasad. But there's a debate. But hasad is so destructive because it means not only you envy that thing in that person, but you want to strip them of it. You don't want them to have that thing. So what was that thing, the khilafah, that the human being has this special status with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So Shaitan wants to strip the human being of that thing. You see what I mean? That's what hasad leads to. And inshallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala save us from that type of feeling. Yeah, but it's a feeling when you see something in someone and you envy it to the point where you want them to lose that thing. It's destructive. If you see something in someone and you desire it, but you don't wish bad for that person, that's not hasad. That's called ghibta. And sometimes that can be acceptable if the thing that you've seen is something desirable, like you see someone who's rich and they give lots of sadaqah and he builds a masjid or something, and you think to yourself, I wish I had the money like he has, so that I could build a masjid. But you don't wish any ill for that person, then that's not hasad, that's ghibta, which can, in that case, is actually, it's okay, it's fine, you know. But when you feel a feeling of destructiveness towards that person, that you want that person not to have that blessing. Now, your nafs or shaitan will trick you here, because, and this is where people don't realize sometimes they've got hasad. Because Shaitan will trick you, because he will say that person shouldn't have that blessing for a reason. For a reason. That person should not have that blessing for a reason. So you think, you don't want that person to have that blessing, but you think it's justified, your thoughts. Yeah? Your thoughts are justified that that person shouldn't have that blessing. So for example, you see a person with lots of money and you have no money, or you have less money. You know, the hasad is you want that person should not have that money, but the justification is he's an unrighteous person. You see what I mean? I do umrah every year. You know, I pray 5 times a day. I do all that person, he's never done umrah. He misses his prayers. He shouldn't have all that wealth, he shouldn't have all that money, he's abusing it. You see how Shaitan can trick you? You're feeling hasad, but you don't realize because it's being justified. See? So the cure for that is to just say, look, you know, Allah knows best his state, Allah knows best my state. Maybe that person is a wali, I don't know. Even if I think, you know, he doesn't practice the deen as much as I do, maybe he's done something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has been very pleased with in his life. Maybe he helped an orphan sometime, you know, and that act that he did pleased Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala so much that Allah has forgiven him all of his sins. And maybe despite me doing all this umrah and prayers and everything, maybe my intentions are messed up, maybe I'm not sincere, maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not accepting any of my actions. You don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, obviously, if you disapprove of what some people are doing, that's fair enough. Especially if they're doing something which is disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's actually a good thing, you know. Because when we see people disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if we feel anger for that, that's anger for the sake of Allah, which is good. So that's a bit different, you know, to wishing someone to be stripped of the blessings, you know. If you start wishing that person he shouldn't have those millions and maybe I should have them, then that's different, because then that could be hasad coming in, creeping in. And obviously what we should do then is just make dua for that person to be rectified, you know. Oh Allah, make him a righteous person, make him spend his wealth in the right way and give sadaqah and so on, you know, rather than wishing that it be stripped from that person. That's where the destructive element comes. So Shaitan, he's got this destructive tendency towards human beings. He wants them stripped of what? Of that thing that makes them special, that thing that makes them the Khalifa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to Iblis, bow to Adam. Why? Because Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa, I'm making in the earth a Khalifa. You know? So that's why they were told to bow. So it's not because of our outward appearance, it's not because of our strength or our courage, you know, like we mentioned before. Animals, a lion has more courage than a human being, you know. There's many like insects we know who do suicide missions to save the queen or whatever, you know, you probably heard of them. You know, certain insects, if their queen or is threatened, they will do suicide missions. Yeah, so they got that, they will give their life. You know, amaliyatul istishhad. So it's not for that, you know, that the human being is special. He is for being that thing that makes him the Khalifa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that thing that gives him that intimate knowledge and closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Shaitan wants the human being stripped of that. That's the thing he's trying to strip us of. You know? That's what the hasad is leading him. So he's working day and night. So when you see human beings that are far away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in disobedience to Allah, you know, just humiliating themselves, you know, undressing themselves, the women undressing themselves and walking around half naked, and people doing humiliating things to them, as losing their dignity as a human being. That's what Shaitan wants, because he's then stripped them of that khilafah, you know, and they will end up in the hellfire. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala save us. So this is why we have to fight Shaitan. We have to be in a battle with him. So he says this is for two reasons. إحداهما أنه عدو مضل مبين. He is a enemy that is trying to lead you astray. لا متمع فيه بمصالحة واتقاء غيلة بل لا يقنعه إلا هلاكك أصلا فلا وجه إذن للأمن من مثل هذا العدو والغفلة عنه. So just like what we reiterated just a minute ago, there's no way you're going to make reconciliation with this type of enemy. He's not interested in reconciliation. All he's interested in is your destruction, and that is his goal, his lifelong endeavor. He wants your destruction, and there's no way we should feel safe from this type of enemy who is always trying to destroy us. Yeah. وتأمل آيتين من كتاب الله تعالى إحداهما قوله تعالى. So he says, reflect deeply upon these two ayahs from the Quran. ألم أعهد إليكم أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم لا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين. The first one in Surah Yasin, verse number 60. Have I not covenanted upon you, O children of Adam? Have I not covenanted with you, taken a covenant, a promise with you, O children of Adam, that you should not worship Shaitan, you should not serve Shaitan. He is for you a clear enemy. Now this is the thing, I mean, what people don't realize, human beings don't realize, that when the atheism is actually the best state that Shaitan prefers, atheism. You know? Because even if you don't follow Islam, even other religious traditions have some concepts of morality. You know, they have certain rights and wrongs. If you look at the world's major religions, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, yeah, all of them have very similar moral code to Islam in the essentials, you know. Things like being kind to one's neighbor, being humble, you know, treating others. So surely Shaitan is for you an enemy, so take him as an enemy. وهذا أقصى التحذير وغايته. So he says this is the most extreme of warnings, you know, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, most extreme of warnings. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you He's your enemy, you know, adu, He's your enemy. And it's an interesting word in Arabic as well, you know, adu. It implies someone who's always active. Yeah, adu is someone who's always active in trying to, being in your enmity as well. Yeah. والخصلة الثانية أنه مجبول على عداوتك ومنتسب أبدا لمحاربتك فهو أناء الليل وأطراف النهار يرميك بسهامه. The second reason why you should always be on your guard and battle against Shaitan is because he is completely devoted to being your enemy. Yeah, majbool, almost like it's inbuilt into him. This is what he's built upon. Yeah, in the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is how he's been created. You know, this is the wisdom and the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that he's there to always be our enemy. You know, and obviously it's part of our test. So he's always preoccupied in trying to fight you and defeat you. During the day and throughout the night, he is firing his arrows at you. فأنت غافل فكيف يكون الحال. And so if you're heedless of this, how do you think is going to be the situation? No? ثم وقعت معك نقطة أخرى وهي أنك في عبادة الله تعالى ودعوة الخلق إلى باب الله تعالى يفعى بفعلك وقولك وهذا ضد صنيع الشيطان وهمته ومراده وحرفته فصرت كأنك قمت وشددت وسطك لتغايظ الشيطان وتكايده وتناقضه فهو أيضا يشد وسطه ليعاديك ويقاتلك ويماكرك حتى يفسد عليك وليعوذ بالله وليعوذ بالله شأنك يفسد عليك وليعوذ بالله شأنك. So he says here there's also another point worth mentioning, and this is specifically for you, he says, meaning this is specifically for people who are struggling in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know? So this extra point here doesn't apply to the non-believers or to ordinary Muslims who are just preoccupied in the affairs of the world. This is specifically for those who are making more of an effort in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Those of the Muslims who have taken this path of purifying themselves, or have gone even further and become people who are teaching others and guiding others. He said this is an important point for you. Think about this, that you are someone now who is preoccupying yourself in the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and calling people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with your acts and your words. Because there are many people, and these are the more effective people in some ways, who are calling others to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just by their actions. Yeah, just by their actions, just by being in a state of ibadah and dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and showing the adab and the akhlaq of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These are people who are calling other people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just by their actions. They don't need to speak even. Yeah? Because people will become attracted to them and look at them and notice them and see them. And this can even be just quite normal Muslims but people who are in a state of, a state of remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like one Muslim brother told me, he in his workplace where he works, he's been working. He's never, he's not someone who gives dawah or anything like that to them. Just a normal Muslim, as you would call a normal Muslim, but someone who's practicing. He said, people from my work, sometimes they came up to me after some years I've worked there, and they said to me like, how come you're always so calm? How come you're never stressed? Because people who are away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they know that everyone goes through stress and they go through hardships and they go from one thing to another. This is the state of human beings. They're in one trouble to another, one stress to another. And the only way people can come out of that is making that connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we were talking about earlier. So people will notice this, if people work with you for years and years or months and months, or they observe you in schools or colleges or wherever they are, or even if they're your neighbors, they will see that in the Muslim, the one who has that connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How come you're not stressed? How come we don't see you going through stress? So this is like you're giving them from your actions. You're calling them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it says, you're now doing all of these things, and this is the opposite of what Shaitan is trying to accomplish. Yeah? You're going against all of his desires and preoccupation, because not only are you saving yourself, but you're also guiding others. And he's trying his best to lead everyone astray. So now you're putting yourself in a position where you're directly in opposition to Shaitan, what he's trying to do. The work you are doing is direct opposite to the work of Shaitan. And you are actually now making an effort. Literally says you're tying your belt, You're tightening your belt. Because when someone wants to work hard, they tighten their belt and they start working, meaning physical labor. So he's saying metaphorically, you're tightening your belt. And you're doing this extra effort to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, in the same way that you're tightening your belt to carry out this work, Shaitan is now going to tighten his belt to go against you. So you're in a state where, like one of the sheikhs I used to listen to said, they send the big shaitans after you. You're now becoming a big threat to the work of Shaitan and what he wants to do. So now he's going to send his big boys after you, to try to stop you, to hinder you. So you've got to be in a state of more caution and more awareness of their tricks and the ways they may get you as well. Okay. This is a really interesting and important point, that this work is the direct opposition of the work of Shaitan. What work is that? This work of being in worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and then taking that out to the people. To become an abd of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and take that then to the people around you, either through your words or through your deeds, just through your actions. And this is the work of all of the prophets, and the messengers. This is their mission, especially the messengers that come with the message to take to people. Because not all prophets had to go on a missionary, but obviously they do it with their actions, just by their actions and being is always da'wah. But some have to take that extra responsibility, like the great prophets who have to go out and then call people to their message, This is the job they do. So you're treading in their footsteps. They're the footsteps that you're treading in. This is the most important work that any human being can do. This is the khilafah. This is what Shaykh Sayyid Ramadan al-Bouti, who I mentioned earlier, he has an interesting book called Al-Jihad fil Islam. Al-Jihad fil Islam. And in there he sort of explaining and expanding upon what is the meaning of jihad in Islam, of struggle. He says the work that a lot of these political groups are doing, what they call themselves Islamic movements or political movements in Islam, He says the work they're doing is a specific type of political work which may or may not be good in itself. It may be very important, but he said we should never become confused that what they are doing is da'wah. What they are doing is not what the Prophet ﷺ and the Prophets were doing, which is da'wah. And the point why he makes this point is because often people do put these political movements under the umbrella of al-da'wah al-islamiyya, as they call it, Islamic da'wah, or calling people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I advise people to read the book, and it is translated in English as well, but I'm not sure how good the translation is. And it's quite a subtle point, but it's very important, you know, especially to understand the time we live in as well. That calling people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what the Prophets did, this is the thing that Imam al-Ghazali is talking about here. This is an action which is in direct opposition to the work of Shaitan. Because Shaitan wants to destroy the human beings. He wants them to get into the hellfire. He wants them to lose that status of being Khalifa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Prophets, they come and they bringing people back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to become worshippers, abd of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. See what I mean? Whereas these political movements, they have a very specific aim, which are stated in their own books and their own manifestos. And their aim is they want to create a political leadership under Sharia upon the in a country or upon this earth somewhere. That is what they want to achieve. And they have a strategy and they have ways to go about that. So Shaykh Abuti said, I'm not saying that this is not an important thing to do. I'm not negating that that may be obligatory or not obligatory or not, but don't say that this is the same thing as that. It's not the same thing. Yeah? So this is the thing, you know, the thing that to follow in the footsteps of the Prophets, this is what it means to become a true worshipper of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then you will be calling the people around you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if you don't say a word. You will be calling them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because they will see you. They will see who you are. They will see your state. Yeah. And so then Shaitan is going to also come at you with full guns blazing, as they say, yeah, at this stage. Because now he sees you as a threat, not just you're saving yourself, he sees that you are now threatening to save others as well. Yeah. بل حتى يهلكك رأسا. So he will now be coming to try to just completely destroy you. He wants you out of the equation. So he will come with so many different tricks. And depending on where you are, he will come with different ways to get you. If you're at the beginning of that path, he will try to sometimes he will try to make you do too much, to burn yourself out. Yeah? So sometimes you see people that start practicing, all of a sudden they're getting long beards, they start fasting every alternate days, Sawm Dawood alayhi salam. Yeah? After a few months, maybe a year or two, you know, inshallah they still remain upon practicing, but in the extreme case they might completely burn out, you know. So he will come to you at ways you won't expect, you know, in these situations. If you're at higher, more advanced stages, he'll come with other ways. Yeah, try to delude yourself into thinking that you've become a big sheikh, a big wali. You know, these type of things. إذ لا يأمن من جانبك بعد فإنه الذي يسيء ويقصد بالحلاك إلى من لا يغايظه ولا يناقضه. He will never be happy with what you're doing now. This is a creature. he's even angry and trying to go against those people that have never even stepped against him. In other words, even kuffar or even other people who are preoccupied in dunya, he's still trying to lead them more astray. He's trying to make them do even more and more worse things. So how about you, the one who's actually turned against him and has actually come to face him, going against him completely. بَلْ يُصَادِقُهُ وَيُوَافِقُهُ. So even those people who are on his side, he's trying to make them get worse and worse, more into sin. كالكفار وأهل الضلال وأهل الرغبة في بعض الأحوال فكيف يظن قصده لمن قام يغايظه وتجرد لمناقضته. So what do you think about what will be his intention towards the one who is actually turning to face him and is actually devoting his time to go against him? Because when you devote yourself to the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it means you're devoting yourself in direct opposition to Shaitan. You're becoming someone now who wants to struggle and strive in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to save other human beings from Shaitan. So you're going in direct opposition to him. فله إذن مع سائر الناس عداوة عامة ومعك أيها المجتهد في العبادة والعلم عداوة خاصة. So Shaitan, against all other people, he has got a general enmity against all other people. But against you, O mujtahid, O the person who is striving in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the path of ibadah and knowledge, he has got a special enmity against you. He has got a special enmity against you. So that's why you have to be the one who is aware of his tricks and aware of how to combat him in a more special way. وَإِنَّ أَمْرَكَ لَهُ لَمُهِمٌ وَمَعَهُ عَلَيْكَ أَعْوَانٌ. Your affair to him is something important, something big. He understands your importance and he needs to pay more attention to you. And he has got many helpers to help him against you. He has got many helpers. أَشَدُّهُ عَلَيْكَ نَفْسُكَ وَهَوَاكَ. The strongest helpers that he has against you are your own nafs and your own desires. The strongest helpers that he has are your nafs and your desires. وَلَهُ أَسْبَابٌ وَمَدَاخِلُ وَأَبْوَابٌ أَنْتَ عَنْهَا غَافِلُ. And he has got ways and means to get in and to get to you that you're not aware of right now. So this is where it comes into studying these type of books and also having guidance from shuyukh. But they're rare to find. وَلَقَدْ صَدَقَ يَحْيَى بن معاذ الرازي رحمه الله حيث قال الشيطان فارغ وأنت مشغول وهو يراك وأنت لا تراه. Finish off with this point inshallah. وأنت تنساه وهو لا ينساك ومن نفسك للشيطان عليك عون. So he says, Yahya ibn Mu'adh al-Razi rahimahullah, he said, the Shaitan, he's got plenty of time to do his job, whereas you are quite preoccupied with other things. And he sees you, but you don't see him. And you are heedless of him, but he's not heedless of you. And from your own self, you have a helper against you. From your own self, you have a helper against you. Someone who's helping Shaitan against you from your own self. In other words, your own desires and your own nafs. So it is vital that you fight and you defeat Shaitan. وَإِلَّا فَلَا تَأْمَنُوا الْفَسَادَ وَالْحَلَاكِ. If you do not fight against him and try to defeat him, then you are not safe from being corrupted and from being completely destroyed. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from the whisperings and the influences of Shaitan. So next week inshallah ta'ala he will go to the next stage. We will say فَإِن قُلْتَ فَبِأَيُّ شَيْءٍ أُحَارِبُ الشَّيْطَانِ وَبِأَيِّ شَيْءٍ أَقْهَرُهُ وَأَدْفَعُهُ. So he says the next thing we will deal with the question, how can I fight against Shaitan? How can I fight against Shaitan, and how can I defeat him, and fend him off? So that will inshallah ta'ala be a good point to start next week in the dars. Some of those things which he will mention. Rahimullah. Any questions? Any questions from sisters? Yeah. Okay, yeah, I mean, it can be used really for all sorts of things, that particular principle. So it covers aqidah issues, fiqh issues, and yes, it could also be applied to the moon sighting. Obviously the problem is normally the ummah doesn't agree upon probably one day, I guess. But if your community, your whole community is obviously doing one thing, my understanding and the understanding that I've taken from my teachers and books I've read is you should follow your community. Follow your community. So in other words, if the whole of London, let's say, is doing one particular day, but you believe that it's another day, it's better for you to follow your community in things like Eid and so on. The only one exception might be if you actually physically see the moon yourself. So you had the ru'ya yourself and it's on a different day to the rest of the people. There's an argument for that particular individual, just for himself, what should he do? But even there's an ikhtilaf, and some said no, he should still follow the community. So I mean the issue is dealt with in books of fiqh, of what you do if in these sort of situations. But generally speaking, I mean, my own position is about the moon sighting in specific. There are several councils, or there's several types of, there's several types of, what do you call those, councils or committees out there that are doing the job on behalf of the community. So in London you have a committee in Regent's Park Mosque. You also have a couple of different ones in north of the country, and they are composed of ulama. Their whole job, they're probably being paid for this, is to figure out when is Eid. And then also on national level, so in Saudi, in Pakistan, in Syria, every country has their own committee of scholars that are paid to do this job. So I don't think that in this case it should fall upon normal people like us, to try to work out when is the Eid, or when is Jum'ah, or when is Hajj. Because there are actually people who are paid, and there's more important things as well to think about. If you do have a lot of time on your hands, there's very much more important things to preoccupy your time, because it is a very complex. If people have looked into it, you'll see there's all sorts of complexities of what degrees is the sun shining upon the moon, and how many, exactly what time does it appear, and is it visibly there, or is it the birth of the moon? All that, I mean, there are people being paid to do this job, and they're ulama. You can't say they're not ulama. Whether there are political influences upon the day, that's a different matter. But we can't really always be suspicious of people as well. I mean, especially the committees that are in this country, they haven't got any political. Well, they might have, I don't know, but they may have other things. But the point is, the answer is yes, it would apply to that, but I don't think the whole ummah does agree upon one particular day. If they did, then definitely that would apply, that particular principle. that the Ummah doesn't gather upon error, you know. Does that answer the question, or was it sorry, yeah. As far as I know, that principle can apply if the Ummah gathers on any particular issue related to Aqidah, fiqh, you know. It's basically ijma', so there's no, it would apply to that issue. Does that answer the question, or yeah? جزا الله عنا سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم ما هو أهله جزا الله عنا سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم ما هو أهله جزا الله عنا سيدنا محمد صلى الله